So tonight we are going to be having a Civil War in character roundtable, and speaking this evening we have Colonel Jim Trent portraying Major Smith of the 2nd Colorado, and then Miss Lori, who's going to be speaking about women's roles during the time period. Thank you for coming this evening. And here at Oklahoma State, through living history, we gain more knowledge and experience and understanding individuals than we can ever get from a book. And that gives us a better understanding, both academically and to have fun on the weekends. So thank you for joining us for our roundtable. And Miss Anna is going to introduce our first speaker.
Lori Chambers from Midwest City has been speaking at forums over women's roles and dress during the American Civil War for many years and has been labeled an expert by others in the living history field. Lori is often sought after for her cooking abilities at Civil War reenactments. She owns an antique shop called Forgotten Lace in Midwest City. Please help me welcome Miss Lori Chambers.
Thank you very much. I'm going to put this, do I connect this or no? I guess I don't. Good evening. Good evening. Just making sure everyone's breathing and looking. Okay, we're good. Thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. And I am Miss Lori Chambers, and I've been a living historian for about 12 years. I've worked with Oklahoma History Center in Oklahoma City. I am actually living in Midwest City at the time. And I have been a living reenactor for 10, 12 years now and connected with the 2nd Colorado. And I definitely believe in making history come alive by portraying it. We learn more, as Brian has said, that we do. So this evening I'm going to talk about the roles of the women during the Civil War. So the Civil War is said to be the first true modern war. That war produced the nation's first mass armies. It had the first aircraft, which were hot air balloons that floated over the enemy lines. They had submarines, as in the ironclad warships, automatic guns, trenches. They had the military draft, and the first organized espionage that the country ever knew. The war was also the first to be reported and presented with photography. In addition, it was the first total war of its time, which means it not only inflicted on the soldiers, but it afflicted civilians, land, and cities as well. The Civil War consisted of 50 major battles and 5,000 minor battles. In less than 5 years, there were over 1.5 million boys and men joining the ranks, which resulted in more than 600,000 killed and hundreds and thousands wounded. More important than that, perhaps any of the above characteristics is the role that us women played in that terrible 4-year conflict. Women, back then in the 1860s, we had been depicted as genteel, pretty little creatures, lacking the strength and the intelligence to do anything for our country. Etiquette manuals back then told us that a lady could not leave her home without a male escort. When the war broke out, the whole sphere of the woman's world changed. They had a vast hand in how the war progressed and eventually ended. Now, with men and 8 to 10-year-old boys running off to sign up for the cause, women were left behind to carry out the men's duties at home. Not only did women manage the daily chores of the household, which were, just to mention a few, candle dipping, soap making, log chopping, butter churning, gardening, cooking, cleaning, washing the clothes, weaving, sewing the clothes, bearing the children, teaching the children, plus they had a farm to run, milk the cows, plow the fields, and that was just in one day. I don't know about you, but I'd be awful darn tired. The women of the South had to take on the work of the slaves who had either been free or flat just ran away, which meant the Southern women now had to do field work. Many women worked as printers, blacksmiths, journalists, and farmers. The wealthy women supervised lumber mills. The widows, at the time, served as government clerks and postmistresses. The Northern women also directly helped the war effort in making munitions. They made weapons and ammunition in the munitions factories. The women in the Fayetteville arsenal made some 900,000 rounds of small arms munitions in 1864. Explosions in 2 arsenals killed over 40 women. Now, the women from the countryside, they flocked to the mills where they made lace and other garments. But they were forced to work under substandard wages, working 15 long-hour days. And the wealthier women that all had silk dresses and gorgeous dresses that we're wearing, we sacrificed and used our dresses for the hot air balloons. Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were teachers at one time. That was about the only job a woman could get back then, was being a teacher. Or if her family was rich and lived in town, they could be a store clerk or something like that. But these 2 ladies were teachers. So they organized the National Women's Loyalty League. Which called for a constitutional amendment to end slavery. They fought for women's right to vote back then. They argued against differences in pay between the men and women in the manufacturing jobs, and they fought for the absolute right to be nurses in the effort to ease the pain of the war. When the war broke out in April of 1861, both sides were not prepared for the onslaught of the wounded that followed a battle. Now remember, back then they thought the war was only going to last 3 months and everybody was going to come home. Didn't happen. There were no trained nurses at all. By June 1861, President Lincoln appointed Dorothea Dix, she was a school teacher, as superintendent of the Army nurses. Miss Dix was very, very strict. She had high morals for her nurses. They had to be over 30 years old. They had to be very plain in the face. They had to wear very plain service cotton dresses, and they had to have good moral character. They also worked 12-hour shifts. They were responsible for the cooking, the cleaning, the feeding of the soldiers, as well as writing letters home for the soldiers. Many of the soldiers joined during the 1860s. Many people did not even know how to read and write. Over 3,000 women, Union women, became unpaid nurses during the conflict. Now, the only nurses that were allowed at the time were Catholic nuns. They served as nurses for both sides, the North and the South, in hospitals and in steamships. I do have some written document from my great-great-grandfather, got wounded in Vicksburg. They loaded him up on a steamship to go back up north, and he was taken care of by a Catholic nun, which was a nurse. So in the beginning, they were the only skilled nurses that they had. And 9 nuns have been reported that died during the war. An estimated 1,000 Southern women nursed in the hospitals. Now, many women chose to go their own way and become their own nurses. Clara Barton, she was an office clerk before the war. She felt it was her duty to assist the wounded. So she began collecting supplies and distributing them to the men. Well, she got pulled right off the fields at the time because a woman's not allowed to be out in the fields. But she was a strong-willed woman, so she went ahead and went out there. But she wasn't one of Mrs. Dix's nurses, so she couldn't work in the hospital, so she thought, what the heck, I'm just going to go out in the field. And which field did she choose? The very one, Antietam, which was the bloodiest one. She loaded up the wagons full of supplies desperately needed by the field surgeons. Now, one thing about here, she also organized a program for missing men in action. She was the very first woman that did that, and it is still inactive now. And she did that by talking to the Union soldiers returning from the Southern prisons. Now, back in those days, when they got caught as prisoners, they were there for a little while, and then they just kind of exchanged, the North and the South kind of exchanged, because they needed their guys to fight, so they would just exchange them. So the Northern guys found out a lot of news from the Southern prisons. And then our very own First Lady, Mary Todd Lincoln, she also visited the hospitals. She visited them daily. She also wrote letters for them, the wounded soldiers, and she also read them stories. Now, 2 weeks after the war broke out, the U.S. Sanitary and Christian Commission was founded by a bunch of New York ladies. These ladies were responsible for making hospital shirts, quilts, bandages, and of course, passing out Bibles. They also raised money to fund the relief efforts. The commission ensured that soldiers received their back pay and their pension, first time in history. It provided help for the disabled veterans coming home, and they also obtained jobs for the soldiers' wives. First time in history that ever happened. They soon entered the field after a battle. Then they began setting up hospitals and diet kitchens and tending to the wounded. There was another organization called the Sick Soldiers Relief Society, in which women made gloves, knit socks, quilts, blankets, things like that for the wounded. There was a shortage of cotton in the South, but that didn't stop the Confederate women by making quilts, blankets, bandages. They made tents, they even made flags. And they made a lot of these out of their petticoats. In the wake of the aftermath of local battles, often enough left were the families of the white and free Negro women and children that followed the Union armies, and they also would live on the outskirts of the camp because they had no place to go. Their houses were just burnt down, the crops were ruined, the animals were taken, so they had no place to go. So they followed the army for protection as well as for food. So some even obtained employment as nurses, cooks, laundresses, and personal servants for the white officers. The Union Army also moved many black women onto nearby plantations to raise cotton for the Northern government to sell. Wives of black soldiers qualified for a widow's pension after the war when they legalized their marriages through the Union Army. Many women found themselves involved in the war as spies and couriers. Now, today's women, we like to gossip and talk, all right? Well, back then they did too. They ranged from all walks of life, from shoe clerks to young plantation owners, to fat housewives, like me, to teenage girls yearning for adventure. There was a lady named Sarah Edmonds. She served as a Union spy. She infiltrated the lines dressed as a black man in order to cross the lines and gather information from the enemy. She then enlisted as a private under the name of Frank Thompson in the Michigan Infantry Regiment. She later shed her male identity, and she then worked as a nurse in a hospital, even taking the time to write a book about her double identity. She even received a veteran's pension and was the first female buried in the Grand Army of the Republic Cemetery. So I don't know about you, but whew, she did a lot of stuff. Women who were in or near the Army camps were subject to careful scrutiny and were particularly if they were walking around the camps at odd times and unescorted. So, if you look at our attires, we can hide a lot of stuff in these outfits, let me tell you. So the hairstyle, on the period, we have our hair parted in the middle. It's neatly confined in a bun. We would hide, back then, they would hide wrapped up letters and maps in our hair. They would hide bottles of morphine and quinine in the folds of our hoop skirts. Some women sewed written dispatches and even put live ammo in the ruffles of their knickers or pantaloons in order to slip past the enemy. We would even use our bonnets to hide written plots. Now, children, we enlisted them also back then. They also helped with the cause. What they did was little girls would carry around dolls, and back then the dolls were porcelain, which meant hollow neck, arms, and legs. Well, back then, because morphine and quinine was so much in demand for the wounded soldiers that they would hide little vials of morphine and quinine into the dolls, and they would go through the enemy lines. Passed very, very easily because no one would dare look at the little girls' dolls. The slaves back then couldn't read or write, so therefore they were very easy to go past enemy lines carrying baskets of eggs which had hidden messages in them because they couldn't read or write, so they didn't know what the heck they were passing over. Then we have Miss Elizabeth Van Loo. She was a Virginia native. She despised slavery. She freed all her family slaves when the war started. She visited the Union prisoners held in Richmond and began taking them food and medicine. All the prisoners talked about the Confederate defenses and the troop movements. So she started thinking, I think I can set up a network of couriers. And she devised a code to get all the information through the lines to the Union forces. Former slaves were often used for smuggling, like I said, because they could be very trusted and they didn't know how to read and write. So we have Mrs. Mary Elizabeth Bowser. She had a slave that she got her job as a house servant for the Confederate President Jefferson Davis. And those two together started collecting and passing information to the South. And then everyone knows Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman, a former slave, she guided hundreds of slaves to freedom to the Underground Railroad. But during the Civil War, the Army asked Miss Tubman to organize a network of scouts and slaves among the black men in the area. And a lot of people don't know this, but she was also a paid nurse for the Union Army. The Civil War is too often spoke of as a man's war. It was reported over 3,000 women disguised themselves as men to serve as soldiers. Now, back then, the Army recruiters, they didn't ask for proof of identity. Most of the recruiters only looked for visible handicaps such as deafness, poor eyesight, lameness. They didn't dare frisk you or look at you like they do nowadays. People back then were very, very modest because it was the Victorian era. They slept in their uniforms, they bathed in their long johns, and they went as long as over 6 weeks before changing their underwear. Many times, women were not even discovered until they were injured or thrown in prison. And then once they were thrown in prison or injured, they found out they were women, and then they got the boot and they got a free pass to go home. But a lot of them went back to the war. It has been reported that over 400 women on both sides have died in battle. The women soldiers of the Civil War engaged in combat. They were wounded and taken prisoner. They even were killed in action. They went to war strictly by choice and knowing that the risks were involved. Working women and poor women were probably enticed by the bounties and the promise of a regular paycheck. And of course, patriotism was the main motive. The women of the Civil War merit recognition in modern American society because they were trailblazers. My goodness, before then, all we had to do was sit home, have babies, and listen to the men come home from the taverns, and that's not a way to live, was it? Was it, ladies? No. So we broke that mold. Their participation in the Civil War became a catalyst for changes in women's roles in society. Successful Civil War nursing and relief war led to an increased number of paid positions for women in these fields in the post-war period. It also led to the opening of the first nursing schools for women in 1873. Women that worked in military factories making ammunition and weapons, became the first Rosie the Riveters. But they also worked hard and long for little pay because they still didn't get the same pay as men did because they didn't have that much intelligence or anything according to them back then. So no longer were the women depicted as genteel, pretty creatures, lacking intelligence to do anything for our country. They left their homes and became printers, nurses, factory workers, and even soldiers, giving these women self-confidence, which fortified the growing feminist movement. These women made it possible for future women like me that loved a country and became enough to become a soldier for 10 years that I did. And while I was a soldier, I was also a nurse. So thank you, ladies, for the trailblazing and for me having become a soldier and a nurse in this man's world. So I appreciate it. Do I have any questions? Please give me some questions. Okay. Hallelujah. Yes, sir. Hi. He hasn't said nothing yet.
All right. So we've talked a lot about the Civil War and the role women played in it. But as you know, during the World Wars, women also played a pretty big role in that. Do you feel that the Civil War or the World Wars played a more important and bigger role in women's rights?
In women's rights?
Yes.
Civil War, by far. Civil War. Because like I said, it was the Victorian and the Edwardian period. Women were not even allowed to leave the home. We can go to church with our male counterparts, but we couldn't even leave the home. Okay, so I feel Civil War. Anybody? Anybody? Going, because once I sit down, that's it.
I've got a question. What inspired you to do this?
What inspired me to do this? I've been I've loved history all my life, and I've traveled all around the world. And if you can understand me, I'm actually Canadian. So, but I was born in America, so we're good. Okay, so I'm a U.S. citizen. But I've always loved history, and I've always wanted to have history come to life. I've got 11 grandchildren, and I've been bringing them to some of the Civil War reenactments. And also, I love history so much because I like to. I work at the Oklahoma History Center because you just can't understand this unless you live it, unless you breathe it, and unless you do it. I am, for several years, 8 or 10 years now, I've been a company cook for a lot of our reenactments that we've been going to, and I just love people coming up and saying, how do you make this, or how do you cook this, or, you know, what were the women doing back then in the 1860s? You know, we're just not pretty faces here. I mean, you could be surprised. I got like 19 layers underneath this, you know, sweating my brains out. But, you know, that's just the way it was. And because you can't get this out of books. You just can't. I think the bottom line is you just can't get this out of books. And you see a lot of people here that love history and that want to be a part of this. And it has to keep on going, because with my 11 grandchildren that don't read the books because all they do is play the electronic games, this is actual living. This is what you learn. This is how you learn it, is when you do it. So I think, and I've been doing it for so long, it's just kind of like second nature, I think. What? We've been doing it for a long, long time, 10, 12 years. Well, I took off my, I didn't wear my corset, so I had to breathe a little bit here. But ladies, do you have any questions, ladies? Any questions? Students? Lady, or sir?
So, an interesting story of how you got into this organization here. But I happen to wonder, why did you get so interested in history when society has come so far in women's rights? And also, what do you feel the importance of knowing history is in contemporary times?
Knowing history in contemporary times. Have you seen the times that we're in? It's crazy. It's all electronic, isn't it? You know, it's all disposable, plastic, isn't it? Back then, during the Civil War, because I portrayed, you know, different eras, and Civil War is my favorite, because it was the Victorian and Edwardian time. Women, there was etiquette. There was chivalry. There was manners. There was no talk back from the kids. And that is gone. That's completely gone from nowadays, except for my children. They know better. But it really is. I mean, when a kid is born, he knows the DHS number, from birth. I mean, no, back then you worked, you had your place in society and your place in the home, and you don't have it anymore. And that's why I think history is so, so important, because we need to know what happened back then so we can go forward. And we also need to learn from back then so we can go forward, in my opinion. And one way of doing it is keeping history alive. And that's why many of us go to reenactments. Many of us, we portray other things. There's other eras that we've all portrayed, different wars that we've all portrayed. Civil War, World War I, II. I've done the French-Indian War before, Revolutionary War. It's all history. And if you don't learn from history, what's the point? What's the point of going forward? You haven't learned nothing yet by going forward, but you can learn everything and use it to the best of your ability to move forward. Personal opinion, but anything else? Anybody else? This dress I did not make because I didn't have time, but I have made all my other dresses. You can ask the gentlemen that are in uniform. All the dresses I have made that I go to reenactments, I have made all my other dresses. I've made all my cooking dresses, my aprons, my cotton dresses, my ball gowns, and this is the first dress I did not make, unfortunately, because I have a full-time job, plus I have my own antique store and 11 grandchildren, but I didn't have time to make this one, so, but I thank you. It's easy they're not too hard to make. They're not too hard to make. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am. Oh, good question. Good question. You know how life goes in circles and cycles. It's very cyclical. Well, it happened again in the 40s, too, with Rosie the Riveter, when the guys came back from war and says, "Where's my job?" And the women had it. They got booted out. So back in the Civil War time, when the ones that did come back, because you remember 1.5 million, joined and all, and a lot of them, 600,000 didn't come home. Some of them kept the jobs, and some of them didn't. Some of them, would marry the surviving men that came home to the towns and then had babies from then, and actually they did go back to their old roles. A lot of them did go back to their old roles because that's what they knew was the old roles. Yeah, but it did establish the postal clerks, postmistresses, nurses, store clerks, things like that. They kept those jobs. Because after the war, they still had wounded. They still took a long time to heal and stuff. So, but the other jobs, they went back to the home. Yes, sir. Oh, good question. Well, actually, the captain of the regiment, or the lieutenant of the regiment, they kept very, very good records, and you could also look for their mustered records. You could get them anywhere. You could even get them online nowadays. But they would, after every battle happened, they would take like a head count, figure out who's here, who's not here, or whatever. And if someone was gone, they either would bury them right there on the spot, or if they were close to the home, they would take them home in a wagon, or they would bury them in the spot if they were far away, and then they would take a letter. And sometimes the letter wouldn't come to the home for 3 to 4 months. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of the boys that joined the military, the men that joined the military, didn't know how to read or write. So they had to, have other people write. And a lot of people don't know that a lot of the officers became officers. Why? Because they knew how to read and write. Not because they were tough. They were just because they knew how to read and write. That's really the reason. But, and also, if you look at the military uniforms now, everyone has a name tag, right? Well, during the Civil War, that was the first time they started putting their names in their uniform jackets, so when they were buried, they knew, and when they unburied them and bring them back home, they knew who they were. So they were the first to do that also. So if you look at today's uniforms, a lot of it goes back to the Civil War, with the name tags and all that. Any other questions? No? Okay, then I'll go ahead and give it over to Brian.
When I hear these individuals speak, the people who led to many others reenacting, as well as myself, it's amazing how history can come alive. I don't know what you imagine when you imagine the Civil War, whether that's Scarlett O'Hara or whether that's movies like Gods and Generals or Gettysburg. But part of in reenacting, we dress up as the individuals themselves did. We're in the same battles, in the same clothes, in the exact same places. And history comes alive, and we can experience as close as possible to what they back then would have experienced. Jim Trent, he's been called many things. Tonight, we're going to call him Major because he is portraying the Major of the 2nd Colorado. He has more than 20 years of experience in the field reenacting, and if I do my math right, he would have fully reenacted the complete Civil War 4 times, and he's beginning his 5th. So if you could, lend your ear to Mr. Jim Trent.
Good evening. Oh my, this is a booming room. I'm here tonight, Major J. Nelson Smith of the 2nd Colorado. And I thank you for the break. I got to leave the column to come in here and speak with all y'all today. It is mighty dusty out on the road from Chakota, Oklahoma to Fort Smith, where my column is walking, because we have to walk because all the animals have died in the drought this summer. But General Blunt wants us in Fort Smith to take it from the Confederates by the end of this year. And there's no choice. The General wants it, so we're going to go. So have any of you good people been through Chakota, Oklahoma? Do you know where that is? Do you know where Muskogee, Oklahoma is? As the seat of the Muskogee tribe, we walked past those folks on our way to Fort Gibson. They were not very nice. They salted the wells in their village so that we could not refill our canteens because they are sympathetic to the Confederacy. They're a little mad at us because we whipped them hard at Honey Springs and drove them from the field. So they've been none too polite to us on this entire march, which is dusty and terrible. It is 3 or 4 days of walking in unending heat and dirt, followed by a squall that will rain for 4 hours and soak the wool uniform, only for 100-degree heat to come back and vaporize the wet moisture out of a man, sapping all of his energy as he walks. And I've got to get 10 miles out of those men every day so that we can get to Fort Smith in, about 2 months. And when we get there, it's probably going to be a fight for us. They've got 2 brigades at Fort Smith. Cable's boys, reinforced by what's left of the 1st Indian Brigade. We broke them up at Honey Springs. Our colored boys, the 1st Kansas Colored, boy, they sure like to fight, let me tell you something. And they spooked the creek something nasty on the right side of the flank. But my old boys from Colorado, they didn't do so bad. We had to walk all the way to Kansas and then walk all the way to Indian Territory to fight these Rebs. I'll tell you one thing, when I get done walking to Fort Smith, I think I'm all done with walking. I think I might just turn my boots and my legs into President Lincoln and tell him to keep them, and I'll just become a stump, because I think I've walked enough for 5 men in this lifetime. I didn't want to be a major, but I had to be. When I signed up, I was one of the few fellows that actually had any military experience. I served a little as a private during one of the Indian uprisings, and I was able to talk 25 other guys into joining the regiment with me down at the saloon, so they made me an officer. And I can do my sums, I can write. Before the war, I worked for the Western Colorado Mining Company. I was a shopkeeper. I had to keep the tabs on all the different departments as they'd break shovels and picks and sorters and everything else that they go through way too many of the days, so that the company could dock all of their pays, nickels and dimes, for all the tools that they busted. The Army thought this made me particularly well suited to leading men into fiery combat and made me an officer. Quite frankly, I should have stayed home. I think I made more money working for the mining company than the $600 a month I make being a major, especially since I don't get off as well as the enlisted boys. You see, the lads, they belong to the United States government. They're privates. So the good old President Lincoln, he gives them uniforms and he feeds them and he buys them ammo and weapons to take care of them. But an officer is a gentleman. He is his own man. So my uniform and my boots, my ammunition and my weapon, and everything necessary to conduct my duty for the United States, into which I am equally obligated and cannot leave, I must purchase myself out of my own pay. I am provided nothing, not even my food. I must purchase my food from the Army in order to eat, whereas the privates eat on the tax dollar. God bless you, Congress. But we'll get to Fort Smith, we'll get to Arkansas, and then when we get there, the general promises will be done. We'll have a gateway into Arkansas. The boys up in Kansas can come down in big droves, and they'll march on to Little Rock, take the capital, bring Arkansas back in the Union. They say we're close to the end of this war. It's 63. We've been at it for 2 years now. We're almost done. There can't be much left to do. Once we get Arkansas, and once Vicksburg falls, we've heard some murmurs about that. General Glantz, he's making progress. I think he's a good fella. It takes an Illinois mule to kick some ticks off a dog. And I think he'll get it done and split the South. And then, by God, when that happens, surely when Vicksburg goes, they'll quit. They'll give up. They'll let us all go home. I would have never said it 3 years ago before we left, but I actually do miss that little one-dog town that we scrapped the earth out of on the side of the mountains in Colorado. It's a long way away, 655 miles by foot all the way here to fight in this end of the war from Colorado. And down out of the mountain, we had a really bad stretch there where the Army forgot to send us coats. So we had to walk out of New Mexico through the blinding snow with one coat to split through between about 150 men. It was a long walk, but we made it, and now we're here. And I think the war is almost over, especially once we grab Arkansas. That'll have them. Then Louisiana will fall, and if we have to, General Blunt says he's ready to go for Texas. He'll drive all the way to the Gulf if he has to. And quite frankly, he's going to need to find somebody else to do that leg because I did this first bit. I'm thinking when my 3 years are up in a few months, I might hang it up early. I know some of the boys, they want to hang around, and the colonel talks about how hard it is to find good officers. But we've taught a few more of the boys to read, and we got this hotshot lieutenant. They sent us from one of them Indian forts up north, and he could do the sums real good. I'm sure he could take my spot, and maybe I can get out of this mess. Quit walking around in blasted Arkansas where the mosquitoes are the size of my hand and it's hot as blue blazes in the shade. The people are ugly and the water tastes bad. I do not like Arkansas. I don't want to be in Arkansas ever again. We've gone to Arkansas 3 times in the last 2 years to fight a battle. Those people just won't sit down. It gives me the tarnations. I don't want to walk into Arkansas again if my life depended on it. Lord, the only thing was good about us starting out in Colorado is we didn't have to mess with that mess they fought up in Missouri when this whole thing started. I wouldn't fight in Missouri if I owned it. It was full of mule-headed people and the worst land to farm God ever created. My daddy was from Missouri. I grew up in Kansas, and I like it out on the plains. And once this war is over, we can open up the West. We can have territories again. They're talking about pumping men into California. We're going to put cattle out there next to them gold mines. And we're going to raise farms on the sides of the Rockies in Colorado. And we're going to bring ranching into New Mexico. We're going to have big states out in the West. We're going to be wealthy. We'll do better than those Ohio guys and all those fools back east choking on their rail machines, running around in a train. I tell you what I don't trust a train. They made us ride a train. And one part of this campaign, we got to ride a train for 20 miles, and I did not like it one bit. I don't want to ride anything that doesn't have 4 legs and eats grass. I'm done with that. It belched smoke and made noise, and they said if they get the thing too hot, it blows up. Well, it's July. It's going to blow up. It's going to get hot. I don't want anything to do with that mess. Just want to go back to Colorado after this war is done and be done with it. But we can't go back to Colorado until the war is over because all the soldiers, all the regulars that normally man our Indian forts out on the territories, they're all back here fighting this war. I really don't care about the secessionists. I'm a Union man all my life, I was born in the Republic. I understand, love George Washington and all that stuff they tell you in the schoolhouse. But quite frankly, the reason I'm here is if we don't get the war over, we're not going to get the soldiers back. And the Indians are going to keep coming down to the hills for hair every year. And they've burned out 3 towns last year. And the minute the regulars left in 61, They went on a whole rampage, and we had to raise up half the civilian population to put them down. And I need those soldiers back, because I want to go back to running my store, and I don't want to be scalped, and I don't want to be burned out. And if that means I have to march from here to Atlanta, Georgia, to get these sea chests to quit waging war on the government so we can get our troops back, that's what I'll do. I don't care about anything else. I don't care about Abraham Lincoln. I don't care about Jefferson Davis, and I don't care about politics. I'm here to get this war over because I need my soldiers back, because I need Colorado to quit burning. And that's why we're here. I know the rest of these people are out for hair and they got causes, but I'm just doing my job. Plus, with all the miners joining the Army, the company decided to reduce the purchasing budget. My job went away. I have a feeling if all the boys come home, we start digging in the earth and pulling gold and silver out of Colorado again, I can get my little shop back, have my job back, then I can do sums, add up who's losing a nickel in their paycheck and who's not. And so that's obviously much more well-suited to me than leading men into fiery combat. Because that little scrap we got in at Honey Springs last week, I don't ever want to do that again. That's a mess. Lines of men hurling lead at each other at 200 yards. That's the dumbest way to fight a war I've ever seen in my life, but that's the way they make it do it. Officer says, everybody get into ranks, ready, aim, bring to bear, fire. We hurl enough lead down the range to kill a head of cattle. They take it, then they aim at us, and they hurl a storm of lead at us. And we sit there, and boys take it in the face and the leg. Man catches one in the knee, it takes the whole leg off. Takes it off slow, too. You remember old George Carley outside of New Mexico? He got hit in the face by a round that didn't have enough powder to penetrate his skull. It knocked him around like somebody was like spinning a tree after cutting a log clear. He just turned around 3 times and went out to sleep. We thought he was dead as a stone. He woke up and walked back into camp 3 days later. Told us it felt like getting hit in the face like a hammer. Didn't cut him, didn't stab him like a knife. He said it felt like something had bluntly struck him, like a great man had taken a log to his person. So I have no interest in being involved in anything like that. I do not wish to be struck in the face with a heavy object. And I'm ready for the war to be over. I'm ready to be done, especially with all this walking. A man can only walk so much. And there's too much dirt down here. It's all this muddy water they have. Water doesn't run clear like it does up in the mountains. We got good rivers. These people all need to move out west and get away from this mess. The water makes us dreadful sick all the time. We lose more guys to their bowels than we do to gunfire. Boy, if a man gets a hold of some bad water and the back end of him turns loose, he'll be dead in a month. And that's the worst way to go. We lose so many that way. Or the stomach bug. They get into something from the locals they didn't eat back home. Something just doesn't agree with them. Man just sick and sick and sick until there's nothing left of them. I've probably lost 15% of my command since we left Colorado to just men getting sick in the gut. I've lost 15, 20 men to bad feet, guy just taking a bad step. You know, I guess if I could confine my casualties to just what we lose in battle, that would be preferred, because illness is tearing my numbers up. It's destroying my ranks. So, but we're almost there, and then the war will be over. But we still need a few last recruits to push on through. I read an article in the paper. We get the paper. It's out of Denver. It's about 2 months late. Last time it was only a month late. So we got some good stuff there. And preacher reads it to us on Sunday after the sermon. That's how he gets everybody to stay till the end, because he won't read the newspaper till the sermon is over. That's a smart preacher. And then he reads us the newspaper and tells us everything that's going on in Denver back home. And Governor Gilpin has called for another 3,000 volunteers. He says we need another cavalry regiment. We need 2 more infantry regiments to do our part for the war. And I know we're a territory, but gosh, if everybody could throw in, we'd get this thing over. One more push. Here we go. 64 is going to be the year. I can feel it. They're almost licked. We almost got them. And I appreciate the boys calling me away from the column and having me coming out and talk to y'all today. And I'll be right back with you. All right? Anyone do questions? You want me to take questions?
Go for it.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes my performance. That was Major J. Nelson Smith of the 2nd Colorado from eastern Kansas. Why don't you give him a big round of applause? He was a super great guy. Would anyone like to know what happened to Major Nelson and the rest of the war? He did re-enlist. In fact, the entire regiment re-enlisted at their 3-year mark. All of them decided to come back. No man wanted to leave his buddies behind. So they all stuck it out together till the end of the war. But Major Nelson, I'm afraid, caught a musket ball in the lung and was killed instantly at the Battle of Blue Bend in 1864, right outside of Kansas City. He was valiantly leading his men in a countercharge at the bend in the creek when he was shot in the side. So, there is a county in the state of Kansas that is named after him. Smith County is named in his honor. And he has ancestors that live in that county to this day. Would anyone have any questions about first-person presentation or anything relating to the life of an officer and the material that I covered during my presentation? Are there any questions? This gentleman here, he's got a question. What's your question, sir?
So you talked a little bit about trains in this little performance, and we know that those were part of an impact that helped change the face of war and transportation. What technologies during the Civil War time do you feel really helped affect the war and change it for the better?
Okay. That's a great question. The question was, what kind of technologies made an impact in the outcome of the Civil War and its conduct, referencing the part of the performance that discussed the trains. I will say this, that train travel was a new idea in the country. Like, trains had really started developing in the 1840s and mainly in the eastern United States. But as we moved into the 1850s and with the gold rushes in California and then the silver strike in '59 in Colorado, and the belief that there would be gold and silver in all of the Rocky Mountains, people were starting to eyeball Wyoming and New Mexico and say, well, there's got to be some silver up there too. Trains were starting to move westward. They were starting to build across places like Kansas and Nebraska, and people did not exactly trust them yet. There had been some really terrible train accidents. People had exploding boilers. People had gotten trains too hot or derailed them or ran them into platforms full of standing passengers waiting to get on the train. All of these accidents happen. You know, we see things in modern media about, you know, if an airliner went down, and we've seen that a couple times with the Malaysian flights disappearing in the ocean. That's pretty shocking stuff for us. Oh my gosh, look at all these people. But it was not unusual 2 or 3 times a year in national newspaper coverage in this time period to read about a train derailing and everyone aboard dying to the tune of several hundred passengers, you know, when a train comes off. But at the same time, even as dangerous as they were in the time period, and the war did help make railroads safer, because railroads were the most impactful piece of technology in the time period, because it allowed the rapid movement of information, material, and manpower back and forth between the base areas, your backfield, your home development areas, your war factories, your armament factories, your training bases, and the front. It was the first time we'd ever been able to rapidly deploy material and men to the front in any war, Before this, I mean, in our previous wars on the North American continent, the French and Indian War, the War of 1812, even our Indian conflicts, material went with you in a big set of wagons, and you dragged everything that you were going to use. And they still did that in the Civil War, but the change was that during the Civil War, if the material and the ammo was in St. Louis or Detroit or Chicago or New York, because of trains, it could actually be to me within like a couple of days. And the ability to control railroads and use them effectively were a decisive factor. 75% or better of the country's rail population, all the railroads that were in the country, and this number gets argued about all the time because we find new data, we find railroads that we didn't know about before that were in the South or the North, but no one disputes that the lion's share of railroad travel developed at the outbreak of the war was in the North, was in the mechanized manufacturing North. They had the ability to produce thousands and thousands of rounds of quality ammunition and move it to a frontline position. The ammunition that the men used at the Battle of Honey Springs to drive off a Confederate army twice their size outside of Chakotah, Oklahoma, that ammo was made in St. Louis. Okay, it was brought all the way from St. Louis into Kansas to Fort Scott, Kansas, down in South Kansas, and transported all the way to the middle of a farm field by foot and wagon by a bunch of troopers, like out in the middle of nowhere from St. Louis. And that ammo was less than 2 weeks old. It was brand spanking new. It had just been made. Black powder ammunition, that's important. It has to be new, and it has to be dry, which means it needs, because the longer the soldier has it, he's a soldier, he's going to get it wet. Especially campaigning in eastern Oklahoma and western Arkansas, which is river country, he's going to get that ammo wet, which is what happened to the Confederates on the other side. They had leftover surplus powder that they had bought secondhand from the Mexican government. Their powder was several years old, and it got wet in a rain squall right before the battle. And so when black powder gets wet, it turns into toothpaste. It actually looks like a black toothpaste. That's the consistency of it. Cased ammunition, which would avoid that problem, putting a bullet and its powder inside a metal case, a round metal case, so that it will not get wet and it will not suffer the ill effects of the weather. That was developed during the Civil War. That is another advantage that we see develop in this time period that goes exclusively to the North. The South knew what cased ammunition was. They knew how it was made. They simply lacked the machinery and the manufacturing base to make it. Like, lots of people ask me, why didn't the Confederates make repeating rifles too? Because the Union brought out the repeating rifle late in 1863 and was actually putting it in the field by 1864. And a man with a repeating rifle, a Winchester or a Henry rifle, could send 10, 12 shots down range in the time that it took a man with a musket to load one. And the Union was just destroying the Confederacy with these rifles. 100 men could fight like 1,000 with these rifles. And they asked, why, obviously the Confederates captured some of these rifles. Why didn't they ever develop the same technology? They didn't have a problem making the gun. They could make the gun. They could capture the guns. They couldn't make the ammunition. They didn't have the mechanized tool, large processing, factory-based machinery to make the ammo. Again and again and again, that's the shortcoming for the Confederate side of the argument, I'm afraid, is that they decided to go into an internal civil war in the middle of the Industrial Revolution without realizing that their half of the country was the agrarian half of the country, and all the factories were up north. And but living historians, we don't get emotional and political about the Civil War. To us, it's a time period. We study it. And we like to say amongst ourselves that the North fought the war with one hand behind their back. They only sent about 10% of their population. There were millions and millions and millions of military-aged young men, not old men, not little boys, not 13-year-old boys and 60-year-old men, which is what the Confederacy was down at the end, because the whole population of the South was about 20% of the population of the country. Most of the country lived in the North. They had millions and millions and millions of men, and they had the ability to make millions and millions and millions of rounds. And the biggest development was artillery. We developed an artillery piece that could shoot a mile during that war, a mile. And this is during a time period when 5 years before the war started, you could only shoot things you could see. And you can't see a mile. And so the idea of developing a cannon that could shoot at something we couldn't see a long way away, and we point it by math, that was invented during the American Civil War. I have seen pictures of cannons that were made by the Civil War that were so big they had to be mounted on trains, and they were manned by 15 men just to get the ammo in it and get the dang thing pointed. It's so huge, it's so massive. So there were basically what the Civil War did was it gave the United States government a purpose to take the new industrial revolution that it was experiencing, take its mechanized factory might, and really take it out for a test drive and see what it could do. It really showed us. We learned a lot. We learned the value of the techniques that we used for using the telegram to communicate between armies were later adopted by companies like Western Union and Western Telegraph to communicate with settlers and businesses as they moved during Western expansion. That network eventually led to the phone system, to the telephone system, and the information grid that we use today. There are lines of your internet grid and your fiber optic grid that you use to use the internet to send data back and forth across the country that lay it down on the exact same tracts of land and the exact same rights of passage that the telegraph companies bought back in the 1800s so that they could run the telegraph lines. They run through the exact same right-of-ways. Those right-of-ways have been there for 130 years. Your internet goes across the telegraph line, aesthetically. Next question. That was a good question. I love technology question. It is the technology war. Next question about the life of the Army, tactics. Yes, it was stupid. Before you asked me, yes, it was dumb for them to line up and shoot at each other in big numbers. But they didn't know any better, okay? The last war we had fought had what was called a musket, and a musket has no grooves in the barrel. The round does not spin. It does not hold its aim. When you shoot a smooth barrel musket, and if I point it straight ahead of me, it could go anywhere over here and over right here. It has a 75-degree rate of variance, either way, or straight up or right into the ground. There's no guarantee when the bullet comes out it's going to go straight. So the only way to hit anything with something like that is to stick a whole bunch of guys together and shoot them all in one direction, and some of these balls will hit. But then we invented the rifled musket, and we took a hot tool and heated the barrel, And we put a set of grooves inside the barrel which spins the bullet, which allows it to fly true and allows it to fly further in an arc, much like you guys see an NFL quarterback throw a spiral football. That's what a bullet coming out of a rifled musket does, as opposed to the old smoothbore ones. And so suddenly, you didn't need to put guys in big groups of blocks to hit something. I've shot something with my reproduction 1853 infield. I go deer hunting with it. It's a great black powder rifle. It's great for the season. And I can hit something at 300 yards with it. Why would I need tactics designed for 200 yards or 300 yards? Well, because the generals and the tacticians and the training methods of the day just did not realize that this new technology had changed warfare. This was the way they ran the army. You get guys together, you put them in a big block, you put them in matching uniforms, you march them out in front of the bad guys, shoot at bad guys shoot at you, shoot at bad guys. One of us is going to give up. If they don't give up, give them the bayonet. Put a sword on the end of your rifle and run over there and scare them. Scare them. Oh, by the way, bayonet. And by the way, we don't have any of that stuff to show you. Obviously, there's very strict weapon policy on college campuses. But come to one of our outdoor events, like where we're not on campus, something where we're out in the field or at a historic site, we'll have all that stuff to show you. But I'm going to tell you right now about the bayonet. I get this from 6th graders all over the country every time I do one. How many people were killed with the Civil War bayonet? Well, the answer is some, not a lot. An examination of Civil War wounds reported by Civil War doctors show that it was about 1% or less of everything that was checked into a hospital. Now, that doesn't include everybody who died out in the field that we don't know about, but the guys who were brought into a hospital were kept track of. And the reason why is because that guy's dead. You can't fix a hole from a tri-blade bayonet. It's not a sword. It's a triangle. It's a pyramid. It's got a triangle shape. So when it goes into you, it doesn't create two flaps like a knife wound. It creates a triangle wound. It's a little hard to sew that up. Sew that side to that side, and so surgeons would just give up. You had a bayonet hole in you, especially in the trunk. That man's going to bleed out. Take him over there and have the preacher go talk to him. Give him some, give him some kind of opium abstract, whatever they got. And Miss Lori talked a little bit about that, about the moving across of different like opiates and just about everything that was a heavy painkiller was some kind. We were just starting the Victorian era to experiment with opiates. This is kind of a new thing, just not very long in. Nobody really knew what they were doing. There was no FDA. Like, this is a good opium factory. This is a bad opium factory. No, it's like, this is just, these people make morphine. The soldiers in the hospitals actually like developed nicknames for morphine. This is the first war that happened in. So it was available. But it was hard to get, especially in the South. The South was always sneaking across the lines whenever they could steal any kind of painkiller. But that's the thing about the bayonet, not a lot. The bayonet is a psychological weapon. If I take my 800 guys and they all put a sword on the end of their stick and they run at your 800 guys, and I've already shot you up a couple of times, are you honestly going to stand there and hold your ground and fight off 800 guys with sharpened spears? No, you're going to run away. That's frightening. That's horrible, especially if they're yelling and they're mad at you. Ah, I got a pointy stick. I'm leaving. I'm out of here. I'm not going to take 35 seconds and load my pistol and possibly get stabbed in the eye with your pointy stick. So the bayonet was a psychological weapon. A large regiment of men charging towards a position with these things gleaming in the sun, screaming like, the scions of Hannibal. And sure enough, most everybody ran away from a bayonet charge. It was designed to scatter the other guy off the field. Then he'd refield, because you can always stop and reform. We're fighting there's more field over there. So we're gonna run away. That's scary. We're gonna stop. We're gonna reform. We're gonna line up. We're gonna get in our big pretty block again, and we're gonna shoot at you. We're gonna hurl little balls at you and hope some of them hit you, and then you're gonna do it again. And there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that. And the idea of modern combat, of breaking into combat squads and moving and using the terrain and getting behind trees and rocks and stuff like that. This is the war that taught us we needed to do that. This is the war that taught us that we needed to dig trenches. That was a great idea. Hey, you know what? When the guys line up to shoot at us, if we're in a hole behind all this dirt, the little balls don't hit us. And that sounds incredibly elementary, but there was literally a colonel in the United States Army who wrote a 500-page paper on that concept. Get in hole, put large mound of dirt in front of you so flying balls don't hit you. He had to sell it to the Pentagon. He had to sell it to the War Department. He was like, this is a good idea. We'll hide from the bullets, and then we'll shoot our turn, and then we'll hide when it's their turn to shoot at us. And the War Department wasn't game. They were like, what? But again, you have to understand that that's the progression of military through all of human history, that the military doesn't change very fast. It doesn't adapt. Our modern military is really kind of a marvel. We should all be really proud of the United States military because it adapts and makes use of technology now very, very quickly. I think this war taught them that. Things like the train, encased ammunition, and tactics and maneuvers, and the ability to move information and material quickly. I think those things taught the Army its first dose of, hey, technology can help us achieve the mission. But it's very hard for armies to grow and change, and so that's why it took so long for us to get the repeating rifles. That's why it took so long to quit fighting in blocks. That's why it took so long to build. Why didn't they build the super big cannon that rode on tank wheels and shot it the first day? Wouldn't have that stopped everything? Well, yeah, probably. Probably. It rolled in a gigantic cannon, day one, but it took a lot of time to get things across to the people who were in charge of both war departments. And so that's one of the reasons the war dragged on so long. Next question. Next question. Next question. Ask me a question. Ask me a question about my uniform or my hat or these lovely boots. Yes?
If the Union was so superior, why did it take them 4 years?
Why did it take the superior technological Union 4 years to win the war? Well, they had an intelligence deficit. When the old wives' tale that all the good officers went to the South is not an old wives' tale. It's true. Okay? Robert E. Lee scored a perfect record at West Point. The first and only time never got a single demerit, never got a single negative mark in 4 years at West Point. Was beloved by all of his instructors. The federal government wanted to make Robert E. Lee the general of the Union Army and offered it to him at the start of the war. And that's just the big dog. I can go down through his chain of command: Longstreet, Jackson, A.P. Hill, Albert Sidney Johnson, just the cream of the crop, guys who were really good at running the Army, and guys who'd all won a lot of experience and done very well in the Mexican War, which was only 20 years earlier. If you'd been a 30-year-old general or colonel in Mexico, you were now 50 years old. If you were still in the Army at 50 years old, you're a colonel, you run a fort, or you're a general. Okay? You still got a little in the tank. You can go out and fight a war at 50 years old, especially if you're a general. And that's exactly where all these Mexican War guys were. They had fought the Mexican War when they were young men. They were in their 20s and their 30s. And when the Civil War rolled around, they were in their 40s and their 50s. And that's where all the Southern generals came from. Look at their ages. They were all in the same West Point classes. They all went to school together. General Longstreet, who gave the command to send Pickett's charge up the hill at Gettysburg, was friends with and hung out with General Grant at West Point. They knew each other. There were several generals across the case. So, and all the good ones, all the guys at the top of the class, went south. They were all from the South. The South has a strong military tradition. Nobody's going to deny that. That is not a fake argument. Oh, that's kind of a fake argument. No, it's not a fake argument. The South has a strong military tradition. To this day, the states of Texas and Oklahoma give more volunteers to our armed services than all the states that are around them, combined. Just the South, the southern half of the country, has always had a strong military tradition. So all the good guys went south, and all the guys left behind, number one, were vastly incompetent. Number two, didn't listen to the good people they did have, because everybody who helped win the war late in the war, all the good generals who came along, people like Meade and Rosecrans and Grant, Sherman, several officers and colonels and guys who had to fight their way to prominence late in the war with good ideas. They literally had to earn their spot by showing good ideas throughout the war, were all ignored at the beginning of the war. Like Sherman, General Sherman, the infamous General Sherman, gets burned in effigy in Atlanta. He told everybody who knew in the Army. He wasn't even in the Army. He was in academia. He was the president of Louisiana State University. They didn't call it that, but he was. And he told them straight up. He's like, people of the South won't surrender. It won't be 90 days. These people will fight for decades. You've just started a war that's going to last a century. And the newspapers told Sherman he was crazy, because he predicted the war would last a minimum of 5 years. And the newspapers were like, General Sherman goes nuts. And the government wasn't really equipped to do it either. We didn't have money in 1861. We didn't have currency. There was no federal dollar bill. There was no United States dollar, $5, $10. Money was issued by cities or private banks. Your dollars said who gave them to you. Well, this is my Citibank dollar, and this is my Bank of America dollar, and this is my City of Detroit $5 bill, and I carry all of that in my wallet, and that's what I do business with. And some of the people I do business with don't take the City of Detroit dollars for obvious reasons, but everybody seems to like my Bank of America dollars, so when I trade with this guy, I've got to use those. There was no federal greenback. Imagine how hard it would be for a nation to wage a war, to like rise up an army, pay it, equip it, feed it, put it in the field, without a standard of currency, without a standardized dollar. First dollar was a chit, it was a little green square. It's about that big. It was given to Union soldiers to pay them. That's how we invented the United States dollar. It's ordered by President Lincoln. President Lincoln one day was like, this would be a lot easier if we only had one money, because he was having to buy all of his supplies and do trade with people overseas. Europeans didn't like to do trade with us because we didn't have standardized currency. They're like, your money is all over the place. Nobody knows what American money is worth because it seems to only be worth to Americans, so the Europeans didn't want to trade with us. When they traded with the Southerners, they traded in goods. When we traded in Europe, we bartered with goods like it was ancient Greece or something. And there wasn't any money and there wasn't any dollars figures. It was these 800 bales of cotton, or these 600 head of cattle, or this much, or a poke of that, or a pound of that, or a pinch of this. It was all this old, almost medieval trade system. They had to try to wage a war with that. Both sides had a problem with that. The Confederacy wanted to have unified currency, and the government, the people in the states and the government fought them on it because they said it was federalism and it would go against the spirits of the Confederacy. States had the right to make money, not the federal government, so that's why it's really hard to find Confederate money. And if you find Confederate, they did make Confederate states money, but they were more like bonds. It was like you were buying a war bond. And you usually bought that with the money that was issued by your state. So I'll buy some Confederate $5 bills with these Tennessee dollar bills, and I have some Kentucky $5 bills. Swap me out. So we invented currency. That slowed it up. That's why it took so long. We had to learn how to do it. We had to learn how to fight a world war, a huge, gigantic war with millions of people who spoke the same language and had the same religions and had the same social customs, like decided to throw their back into beating the snot out of themselves. And that's one of the reasons it took so long. The idea is ludicrous, that the people in our country, which is a country of the people, where we have a common shared heritage, there were a lot of people in the North that just couldn't believe it was happening. What do you mean a portion of the American people have risen up and they don't want to be a part of the country anymore? That's insane. And what would you say if, we're all here in Oklahoma. What if all of a sudden the city of Tulsa said, we are no longer a part of the state of Oklahoma, we are the Republic of Tulsa? We'd all be like, you guys are nuts. What are you talking about? I have to go to an appointment in Tulsa tomorrow. Do I need a passport to come to your town? And there were questions like that. A lot of people were like, is secession even legal? I don't even know we can do that. The Confederacy itself was so young and was struggling to build its government while it was fighting the war, and it still held on for 4 years. But the bottom line is we didn't know how to do it. That's why it took so long. We didn't know how to win. They didn't know how to win. Nobody knew how to do it because it was the first time anybody had done this. It was the first time any group of Americans was like, we're going to uprise against the American government. Another group of Americans said, we're not going to let you. It's the first time it had ever happened in our history. I'm going to tell you right now, why didn't the South win the war in 4 years? Ask that question. Because I get the question about the Union with all its military might. Why didn't the North win the war in 4 years? It took them almost 5 years to win the war. They had all the advantages. Well, they had idiots running the show and they didn't know what they were doing. Why didn't the South win the war? Well, they didn't have enough stuff. They didn't have enough railroads. They got cut off from trade from all the European powers. They had an itty-bitty tiny population, and then a portion of that population, the portion that were slaves, they would not allow to fight. Well, whoop, there's like 1/4 of the South right there. Did African Americans fight in the Confederate Army? Yes, they did. Yes, they did. Several Confederates. 1, 2 at a time, 5 at a time, little groups. Some regiments allowed them in, but not to the tune of several hundreds of thousands, of tens of thousands of men like the Union enlisted. They never let that happen. And to the credit of some Confederate generals and some members of the Confederate government, recommended that. General Patrick Cleburne was almost drummed out of the Confederate Army because he suggested that freeing the slaves was a great way to raise up another couple million men for the Confederate Army and let them fight for their freedom. And he was a Confederate. He was a Confederate general, ran one of the most successful divisions in the Army. So it was a first time for everybody. There were several opportunities for both sides to win the war, to strike the killing blow, and it was always missed. And my bearing has always been, nobody knew what they were doing. This is the first time out for everybody. It's the South's first rebellion. It's the North's first time putting down a rebellion. Everybody's going to make some mistakes. Next question. Next question. That was a great question. Yes, sir. It's young man. That's a great question. If somebody changed states before the war, would they be more typical to side with their home state they used to live in before the war if they moved from like the South to the North? That happened a lot. That happened a lot. It's a unique fact that it wasn't, although there was a lot of geography involved for a lot of people, it wasn't always a north-south issue. Usually, the divide socially and politically in the country, you would have made that decision in the 1850s along the same lines as people were making that decision in the 1860s. But the problems that resulted in the Civil War about slavery and abolition and how the government was ran and state rights and those arguments, which hadn't really been addressed, that was part of the problem. The Congress wasn't having the conversation. They were just ignoring it. They kept kicking the can down the road. And they needed to talk to it about eventually. So you would have been aware of that in 1850 or 1840 or all the way back to 1820. This was a long discussion, went all the way back to the Revolution about what are we going to do about this slavery thing? What are we going to do about states' rights? Who's really in charge? Is there one federal government or are there lots of little governments? We hadn't quite figured it out. And so chances are if you moved from the south to the north, it was because you thought the northern argument was correct or you wanted to do business on it. Now, did people with mixed loyalties go home? Yes. A lot of people from, the reason we have the state of West Virginia is because Virginia and West Virginia used to be one state. That was all one state. That was the state of Virginia. And the people who lived on the other side of the mountain, because the Appalachian Mountains run down that side of Virginia, were all they weren't exactly anti-slavery, but they were extremely pro-union. They didn't want to leave their country, no matter what the argument was. They're like, you might have a legitimate case on slavery, but I'm not going to break the country up over it. We should at least have the conversation. No, I will not secede with you. So like half of Virginia suddenly became West Virginia, and we got a new star on the flag. Go team. Okay? President Lincoln had no problem pushing that through. He's like, yeah, those people in West Virginia, they want to have a state. We can make that happen. You know? That's the reason why there's a state called Arizona and there's a state called New Mexico. Because Arizona was all the western territory that the Confederates conquered coming out of Texas early in the war. I bet you didn't even know that happened. Yeah, that's why Arizona is called Arizona. Arizona is what the Confederates called New Mexico when they conquered it in 1862 for like 3 weeks. And then they ran off because it was very dry and there's not a lot to eat in New Mexico. So that's a... And the other thing to remember is that you had Union sympathizing Southerners. The 2nd Colorado, our regiment that we portray when we do events here in Oklahoma, we're out at like Honey Springs or Cabin Creek or Fort Gibson, there were people in that regiment that were from Georgia, that were from Virginia, that were from South Carolina. There were people in that regiment from Alabama. There were 14 Texans in that regiment. These guys are wearing blue uniforms. It's not that they hate their home state, it's just they believe in the other side of the argument. And the same thing happened. Arkansas gave as many units to the north as it gave to the south, which is really cool because there are battles in the Civil War where the 1st Arkansas fights the 1st Arkansas. Isn't that weird? Must have sounded odd on the battlefield. So the geography did matter, and there was a lot of refugeeism, if that's what you're curious about. There was a lot of relocation. The poor people of Tennessee were conquered. Kentucky and Tennessee were taken over by Union troops so fast that they spent the majority of the war in the North, in the Union. There were whole towns that had voted for secession. They were overran in like a couple of weeks. A good portion of Tennessee just fell to the north immediately, even though those people voted for the Confederacy. So it didn't matter where they lived geography. You are suddenly living deep within the other team. And it was a hard life. Northerners who supported the idea of secession and state rights were called Copperheads. And they actively worked with the Democratic Party to like undermine Abraham Lincoln and try to like end the war in favor of the South from within the system. Guess what? That's legal. It's called political rights. If they think secession should be legal, they just haven't left the Union. They have the right to like vote and organize and hold rallies, and they did. Ran candidates. General McClellan was a Democrat and wanted to end the war, and he was a general in the Army and ran against President Lincoln in 1864, and he was talking about ending the war, and he used to command the whole dang Army. So it's a good question, and geography did play in the way you felt and what you did in the war, and there was some refugeeism. But a lot of people just stuck it out. That was their home. You didn't have a lot of choices. It wasn't like you could get on, apartments.com and, put in reason for move. Oh, Union Army has come through and burned me out. Hit enter. No, that wasn't a choice. The county or the state or the town you were living in, even if you had relocated early in life, people only relocated in this time period 1, maybe 2 times in their entire life. So you've probably put 5, 6 years into a place, or you're planning to put 5, 6 years into a place. So whatever you're doing is not, well, I'm going to work at Taco Hut for a couple of years while I go to school, then I'm going to figure out if I want to live in Chicago or New York. No, when people made a decision to relocate in the period, this was for life. There was a good chance they were going to bury us wherever we were going. We're going to move to this new place and we're going to catch smallpox, and that's where they'll bury me, is right there. Because being sent home to be buried at home, that was invented during the Civil War. A process for doing that was actually developed. Embalming was improved. The ability to move a body long, long distances was developed because people in the North wanted their sons who had died in Southern battles. They didn't want their sons buried in Georgia or Arkansas or Alabama or Florida, because there were guys from New York who died and were buried in Florida. They might as well have been sent to Mars when it comes to distances back then. Can you imagine? There's no such thing as embalming. There's really not any body preservation technology, and somebody decides they're going to go down to 120-degree lusty Florida and get their son and bring him back to New York City, New York, up the coast by ox cart or by ship. That's going to smell great. You really love that person because you're going to walk with their smelly corpse all the way across 10 states. Wow. And so guess what? That was a bad situation, and plus for everybody who had to witness it and every town that body had to pass through, and suddenly there was great public demand for a clean and less smelly way to move bodies great distances, and so we invented that technology thanks to the Civil War. So those are some of the geographical effects. And after the war, if you had been caught on the wrong side or you'd been forced to move away because the community was not friendly, there was a lot of returnism. A lot of people came back. Well, I got ran out of such and such before the war because I was, pro-Confederate, but my farm's still up there, so I'm going to move back. And there was a lot of the after violence, and a lot of the grudge matches, a lot of the old gunfighters from the Old West period, the Hatfield and McCoy conflict in Kentucky and West Virginia was because there were people in the families that had been on either side of the war, and they knew that so-and-so was a Union veteran or so-and-so was a Confederate veteran, and they held a grudge. And so there was a little aftermath after the war and that stuff. And so but those issues had to be dealt with for the first time. I will say this, that after the war was over and it was clearly determined that we are one country. We are the United States of America. We are. We not is. There's not many of us. There's one. We are. We are one country. And they wrote songs about it, and they published books about it, and they wrote newspapers about it. It was a big, big deal. And when that was decided at the end of the war, the idea of living anywhere in the country suddenly became attractive because your state was no longer your country. Your county was no longer your environment. You did have a big country. And there was this new thing out west. There were all these new places to go out west. And several of the northern soldiers who fought in the South, some of them thought it was pretty. Some of them did not dislike Arkansas. If anybody's from Arkansas, I apologize. Those are actually Major Smith's real opinions about Arkansas. He could not stand it. But in his personal notes, he was constantly bit and afflicted by what he called varmints, which are little biting bugs, chiggers basically. They didn't have the word chiggers because they were all from up north. And they didn't have the little red bugs that bite you, and they bite you in the worst places they can bite you in. Anybody who grew up down here knows what I'm talking about. And the northern guys from like Wisconsin and Michigan, it's too cold up there. They don't get those little bitey bugs, and they did not know what these things were. Those poor guys from up north and like back east, and every time they went into the South and got chiggers, they just cried unto God. They wrote letter after letter about these terrible little, and they called them varmints and other things, lice. They called anything lice. They called roaches lice. They called chiggers lice. Anything that bit you, and it was their greatest enemy, was the bugs. They'd rather fight the enemy than fight the bugs. But so good question about geography. One more question. Gosh, we're going late, aren't we? One more question. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's the big one. It's the big cause of the war question. I always get this one. The war was inevitable. The cause of the war was an unwillingness to solve the issue of slavery and federalism at the very beginning of the Republic. The Founding Fathers, in order to pass the Declaration of Independence and get the young country up on its feet, had to take a compromise on slavery and the argument that they never solved the question, who's running the show? Are we one government, or are we lots of little states that just hang out together? Which are we? And they gave that a pass. Quite frankly, I don't blame them. They had bigger fish to fry. The Founding Fathers were trying to get a country started against the most powerful regime in the world. I'm going to forgive them on not figuring out everything that was going to go wrong with the country for the next 100 years. But that's really what it was. And then never in succeeding generations after that, from the Revolutionary period, and that's an interesting period, guys. I know they don't teach you a lot about that in school growing up. It's considered kind of a dull area of history because we don't fight a lot of wars and we kind of just grow crops and hang out. But politically, if you read over the 60-some-odd years between the Revolution and the American Civil War, Congress and the president and the political system really just never answer the question. They never bring it up. They just get busy doing other things and they ignore the 800-pound gorilla in the world. So I think the biggest cause of the war was procrastination, kicking the can down the road. It would have been easier to solve during the Revolutionary period. It actually would have been easier to figure out. I think industrialization versus an agrarian culture was another big factor, was the fact that the North was industrial and that it had found that a better way to, it's much better to have somebody that you pay a nickel a day to work in your flour mill is much more efficient than having slaves that you're forced to like clothe and take care of. There was slavery in the North. It was wage slavery. People lived in filthy conditions, made pennies on the hour every day. Don't ever fool yourself that the North was all emancipated and intelligent and the South was just a Luddite that refused to get with the program. They both had a large forced labor force, but I mean in the South they were black slaves and in the North they were immigrant factory labor that were paid pennies on the day to work. And it's just what they were doing to make their money. It was also a large part of American need to build the economy. Northern manufacturers wanted the rest of the country to buy their goods. Don't buy pots and pans from England. Buy pots and pans from New Jersey. Well, the pots and pans from New Jersey are terrible, and the pots and pans from England are really good. So the South would rather import pots and pans from England than buying them from their friends up in New Jersey. Well, then the friends in New Jersey and their friends in New York and their friends in all the other manufacturing countries go to Congress and say, it should be a law that you can only buy stuff made on this continent. I believe there are people having that conversation right now in our current national dialogue about what should be made on this continent, what should be made other places. If you read some of the arguments from the period, you will recognize some arguments that we're having about our relationships with China right now in what is being said about the relationship between buying stuff from Europe in the Civil War. It was a very real discussion. Tariffs and trade income and things like that. The South wanted to be able to buy whatever they wanted from whoever they wanted for bales of cotton. They didn't want a federal dollar. They didn't want a standardized currency because they liked the barter system because they could work it to their advantage. And then, of course, the abolition argument, which kept getting kicked down the road. It was going to have to be dealt with eventually. Everybody assumed slavery was going to die out, and to that argument's credit, it was. But then automation and certain machines and tools and markets suddenly made it profitable to keep slaves. And that caused the problem. It's like everybody in the room, we know eventually, because eventually the environmental people are going to get us all driving some kind of car that doesn't hurt the environment. And I'm going to have to give up my Pontiac GTO that sits under a cover in my garage that I take out on weekends with my wife to the car show. I'm going to have to give that old guzzler up. I love it. It'll pass anything on the road except a gas station. But someday those cars are not going to be around anymore. And people in the period talked about slavery that way. They talked about the fact that it was an idea that was going to have to be dealt with, but nobody had a solution. And radicals on both ends of the argument, and this is another important lesson that we learn from history, because somebody asked that question, was what's the importance of learning this history for today, is that the one thing that did really lead to is that radicals on both sides of the argument were allowed to control the dialogue and whip everybody up into a frenzy and get everybody beaten on each other. It's fine in America. We should argue with each other. We should have debate. But dear Lord, let's not start picking up guns and shooting holes in each other just because we disagree about an issue. That's just how mad people got. And people manipulated the system. People in the South made huge political strides in their personal careers. People became governors and senators, had great deals of, and it's a power move in the new Confederate government. And industrialists and bankers in the North made tons and tons and tons of war profiteering off of the deaths of Union soldiers. So there was a lot of manipulation, a lot of factors on both sides. But at the end of the day, I do believe that the one biggest key issue was that they never really had the guts to have an honest discussion about slavery and come up with a plan, which is too bad because we're a smart country. And they were a lot of smart guys. I read their letters. I read their journals. The language they use is not our language. Some of the words they use, I have to look them up. Does anybody know, anyone in this room knows what a cooper is? You know what profession a cooper is, what a cooper does? A cooper's a guy who makes barrels. He makes barrels. He's a barrel maker. They didn't call them barrel makers. They called them coopers. I had to look that up. I was reading over some records. It said 17 coopers joined the regiment. I was like, well, that's nice. They're all from one family. And then I got corrected by my professor, and I had to go back and learn what a barrel maker was. They were intelligent guys. I think they could have figured it out. At the end of the day, it was procrastination. Good question. Last question. Great last question. Great last question.
Well, thank you, Jim. Could we give him a round of applause? It's interesting, by listening to someone else speak about history, there's a little bit of irony, because we're living historians. We like to live it ourselves, not necessarily read it from a book or hear those stories, but it is these stories that we relive. There are many things that go into making an army possible. Humorously enough, we have a standing militia, we have guns, we have uniforms, we have men. We actually reenact the war. There are many things that play into that. Something of that brought you here this evening. We have a large range of ages. We have college students and people who are well and above college in both education and experience. But it's that love for history that brought you here tonight. And almost all of you who are here, and those of you who are listening on O State TV and YouTube, are still engaged because of that passion. Now, before we have some closing remarks by Colin Jefferson, the original founder of our club, I would like to draw a few quick parallels of our club here at Oklahoma State and the history that we are reenacting. This would not be possible without Oklahoma State University. We are sponsored by the Student Government Association, by Campus Life. Kent Sampson, he helped make this event possible, as well as all the arrangements that have been made beforehand. But everything that you see that we're wearing, the events that we drive to hours away, that's paid for out of our own pockets, what isn't sponsored by the university. Jim Trent and the Oklahoma Historical Society that loan us the gear, somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000 worth of equipment, so we can live history during the weekend and have an educational experience. Now, many of you here in the audience tonight are simply students. But if you're not a student, if you're someone listening on O State TV or wherever you may be, and you would like to donate to our student organization or even the Second Colorado, that will ensure that living history is possible for many generations to come. I know the dresses are made by the beautiful ladies that wear them, and all of this uniform that I'm wearing, I've purchased myself. And as Mr. Trent pointed out, it's not easy for an officer to buy his own clothes. And so if you would like to contribute to make it possible for other people to live history as we do on the weekends, please send us a donation and contact us via Facebook, Living History at okstate.edu, or even the nonprofit organization of the Second Colorado. And the final closing note is this wouldn't be possible without the people who contribute not only their finances, but their time. So quickly, I would like to introduce the two people in uniform. I won't ask you to speak, but if you could just come up on stage. You look so good, and you've been so instrumental in helping students along, whether you're the advisor for our student group or whether you have the nickname of preacher and in your moral guidance. Maybe I'll just mention them. I don't know if the camera would like to span to them or not. Mr. Bevers, Phil Bevers, he is our advisor for the student group. If we could give him a round of applause. And then Mr. John Pryor, he's been a part of our organization for years, and he is with us here today. A round of applause. Mr. Colin Jefferson will give the closing remarks, since he is our original founder of this organization at Oklahoma State University. But one last time, I'm going to ask for your money, because without that, this organization would not exist. And for you people here in the audience, or whether you're students watching this on O State TV, join us so you can experience history and learn it through living it. Mr. Jefferson.
Well, folks, I won't keep you any longer than you already have been here. I'll just close with a couple minutes of remarks. I just want to say that today is 2015, and we all realize that. And we up here, we love history, we love going back in time, we love to time travel. We really believe that we can time travel, not with Einstein's physics equations where we have some big machine that takes us back and we see Lincoln in the flesh. Well, we pull the past forward so that we can see it. And 2015 in this modern world is about innovation. And innovation is not limited to those phones in your pockets and those laptops in your backpacks. Innovation is about doing something new and doing something better. And what we founded this club on is the principle of innovating in how we learn about the past, which is just as relevant today and influences the future just as much as it did back then. We have labs here at Oklahoma State to study aerodynamics, to study science, chemistry. Goodness gracious, we have a lab where little kids from Stillwater come to preschool, and our students who are studying teaching can observe the little kids in action. Well, even in the great universities that are not land-grant, don't focus on these hard sciences, things that focus on philosophy and history and things like that. All back in the East, Harvard, they don't innovate. They still teach out of that textbook, history. What we have created is we've created a laboratory to experience history, to find out the questions about the emotions and how people felt and what it meant to be in that time, and perhaps we might answer the biting questions of today of, is that offensive? Should we forget about it? Should we rewrite the past? We need to answer these questions, and society is crying out for that on social media. Well, let's get into our laboratory, and let's take a look and see what we really think for ourselves, what was going on, and how it impacts us today. And I just want to challenge all of you guys to think about that and innovate throughout your life in every aspect. Thank you guys for coming. Have a great time at Oklahoma State. As an alumni, I loved it, so go out there, study hard, and make an impact, please. Thank you.